Hello again. Today we're going to talk about Sabbath. As we think about abiding in Christ, Christ abiding in us, we're going to talk about Sabbath. That includes play, believe it or not, and how those things help us abide in Christ. So sometimes we, as kind of New Testament Christian people, can get confused about Sabbath because we associate it with Old Testament law. And if Jesus fulfilled and therefore did away with the law, why do we even need to think about Sabbath? And didn't Jesus heal and do things on the Sabbath that maybe he wasn't supposed to, supposedly? Didn't that show that we don't really need to think about it anymore? And that kind of confusion is understandable, but it's also misguided because the idea of Sabbath comes from God as a gift to humankind. And in our culture of unrelenting busyness, it's a gift we desperately need to receive. So a technical definition of Sabbath is a 24-hour period of rest, of ceasing from work and labor, observed in the Jewish tradition from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. It's rooted in the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2, where the 6 days of creation each last from evening to evening, and where God rested on the seventh day after completing the good and astonishing work of creating everything. We're told there that God blessed that day and made it holy. The first mention of Sabbath as such is found in Exodus 16 in regard to the people's gathering of the manna. They would collect it for 6 days, but on the sixth day, they were supposed to collect enough for that seventh day because that was to be a day of rest. And there, in that passage, Sabbath is clearly delineated as a gift from God to the people. Now, if you remember the story, you remember that the very first time that happened, some went out on the seventh day to collect it anyway. And God wasn't best pleased with that. But it's good for us to remember that the people were newly freed from slavery in Egypt, where they had been worked ruthlessly and denied rest at all. In fact, they had been accused of being lazy. And so it makes it easier to understand that they found it hard to trust God and not go out on that seventh day. It takes time to undo years of conditioning. We can look at them and say, well, they should have just believed God. But how many times do we doubt the provision of God? I think we need to have some compassion for them and for ourselves. It's hard to undo years of conditioning of thinking that we need to rely on ourselves and we need to just work hard all the time. So after that story, we then see God commanding an observance of the Sabbath in Exodus 20, number 4 of the 10 Commandments. And so why? Why is keeping the Sabbath such a big deal? So this is my favorite answer. Keeping Sabbath is a consistent rhythm of rest that serves to connect humans with their Creator. God rested after 6 days of doing work, and observing a Sabbath with the correct perspective connects us to God in ways that other observances simply don't. The purpose of Sabbath is to bring restoration to our bodies, minds, and spirits, remembering that only God is infinite. We are not. We are finite. We have limits. We can't go 24/7, 365. Only God can do that. And Sabbath also allows us time to worship and connect with that God who created us, who provides for us. Sabbath is good. It serves as a weekly memorial of creation, a sign of God's covenant, and a crucial break for physical and spiritual restoration. It focuses our attention on rest and worship and stopping productive labor to prevent the idolizing of our work. So I want to talk about that for a minute. Idolizing work. I've mentioned this in the past. You may have heard it from me. You may have read it somewhere yourself. Have you heard of the Protestant work ethic? Well, what is it if you haven't? The phrase comes from a 1904 work by German sociologist Max Weber that linked the idea of working hard to prove one's status as the elect, and it links that working hard to capitalism. It's more Calvinistic than Lutheran, but it did come from the Reformation. It is a Protestant thing in Max Weber's work. Now, I'm not making the point that working hard and the work ethic leads to capitalism. That's not the point I'm making. In relation to Sabbath, I'm saying that the idea of working hard that comes in that Protestant work ethic as an expression of faithfulness to God, that has calcified into a disdain for rest. And the evidence that I see that the Protestant work ethic is in some measure real includes these kinds of things. The inherited or the inherent idea that hard work produces wealth, and wealth is not for leisure, but for reinvestment and safeguarding one's future. That hard work is what God wants and expects from us at the expense of other things. That hard frugality is virtuous. That personal responsibility and self-reliance are paramount. That productivity is the measure of a good and upright person. Think about that for a minute. If somebody's not producing in this world, do you think of them as a good person? I don't know. The Protestant work ethic leans toward thinking that it is holy to be in a position to give, but it's shameful to be in a position of need. After all, if the person just worked hard, they wouldn't need help. And the fact that they need help proves that they haven't really worked hard. They haven't worked hard enough. In this view, rest can be perceived as laziness, which is seen as a sinful waste of time that leads to one being in need. We're supposed to work hard. Can you hear any echoes in there of your own worldview? Younger generations might not hear it as loudly, but I know I can hear it. I know that messaging was strong. You work hard, you save your money, and if you're working hard, then you can judge people who are in need, because if they just worked hard, they wouldn't be in need. I think it's hard to argue that there's no residue of that ingrained generational expression of work hard and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and don't be lazy. And you can hear how this causes a judgmental attitude towards the poor. They wouldn't be poor if they just worked harder. And that very attitude keeps us blinded to systems that perpetuate poverty. That's not healthy. So we need to be aware that at least some of this way of thinking comes from the Reformation idea that all work, not just that of the clergy, of priests and nuns and monks and the like, the Reformation idea that all work is holy and honoring to God. That was a necessary change in thinking, and it's true. But like many things, the pendulum swing brought unintended consequences. So please don't misunderstand. I am not arguing to be lackadaisical about work. That's not what I'm saying. God is at work in the world, and we honor God by participating in that good work in the world. I'm just saying that when we start to consider God's call to Sabbath rest, we might have to do business with internalized messaging that sees rest as akin to laziness and displeasing to God. We might have to do some work around that to change our mind. But if we want to grow in relationship with God, we've got to do that work. I encourage you to spend some time with God reflecting on where this might be coloring how you see the world and yourself, remembering that an inability to rest actually shows that we're a slave to something. If we can't rest, we're enslaved to something. All of this is invitation. There is no condemnation. I'm inviting you to think about it, look at it when considering Sabbath rest as a way to abide in God. So partly because of that work ethic, Sabbath can frequently be experienced as a challenging gift. Challenging because it forces us to realize and release control of our lives, trusting God as the one who sustains and provides, and it brings us face to face with the idol of self-reliance and identity value from what we do over whose we are and who we are. So many of us do get our value from what we do at work, from what we produce. And Sabbath confronts us. That's why it's a challenging practice. It's a gift, though, because whether we believe it or not, we do need rest. We need to remember we are not in control. We need to see God as the sustainer of our lives. We need to remember only God is infinite. We are finite. It's always good to remember that we are not indispensable to the functioning of the world. As a Scandi TV show that I watched during COVID said, the graveyards are full of indispensable people. Sabbath reminds us that God is the one who sustains, not us. All right. So how do we, like the Israelites, come out of slavery of our own work ethic and embrace the wonderful gift of rest that God gives us? Well, we practice it. We work hard at practicing rest. And that will probably look different for each one of us. And as we think about how to craft a personal Sabbath space and practice, let's remember that Jesus did fulfill all the law, and Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. He not only reminded us that the Sabbath was made for us, not us for the Sabbath, that it is God's gift to us, he also modeled a rhythm of regular withdrawal for prayer and to spend time with his disciples. After that rest and renewal, he would enter again into the work God had for him to do. So he modeled that rhythm for us. Remembering who Jesus is and how he modeled that Sabbath will help keep us from turning it into an idol. And thinking this way can also help keep us from getting too bogged down with specific days or times. Some people consider only Saturday to be the Sabbath, reading that seventh day that God rested as Saturday. The Jewish tradition sees it Friday evening to Saturday evening. Others call Sunday the Sabbath. But some of us align it with a normal day off from work, like a Tuesday or a Thursday. Each one should practice as their own conscience allows. I don't think the specific day matters as much as that we actually observe a Sabbath. In other words, the purpose of Sabbath is more important than the rules of the Sabbath. And I think that's what Jesus came to show. So author Ruth Haley Barton frames Sabbath keeping as a way of life that works. She points out rhythms of nature, like productivity and dormancy, filling, emptying. Nothing in nature can endure endless production. Rest is simply part of how God designed things to work, and we need to remember that for ourselves too. So what might Sabbath keeping look like for us today? And this is where play begins to enter the picture, especially if we have young children, since Sabbath is best when practiced together. And Sabbath will look different at each different stage of life. It's not going to be consistent all the way across the board. The point is to withdraw and to rest. So we tend to forget, and when mentioning about play, we tend to forget as we age how restorative and healthy joy and laughter and play are for our souls. So we definitely need to take that into consideration when crafting a worship practice. Dallas Willard, one of my favorite authors, says something that some of us might find surprising. He says that we should, to begin with, think that God leads a very interesting life and that he is full of joy. Undoubtedly, he is the most joyous being in the universe. The abundance of his love and generosity is inseparable from his infinite joy. All of the good and beautiful things from which we occasionally drink tiny droplets of soul-exhilarating joy, God continuously experiences in all their breadth and depth and richness. When considering everything involved with having a flourishing life, a life that reflects God well into the world, we can't forget that joy and play and beauty are integral pieces of that, because those things are integral pieces of who God is. If we want to be serious about following God, then we can take playing and being joyful and resting seriously as well. Just think about that for a little bit. I'm going to say it again. If we want to be serious about following God, then we can take play and joy and rest seriously as well. Can you see God as a joyous being? Do you see God as a joyous being? What would it look like for you to take being joyful seriously? So to begin crafting, practicing Sabbath for yourself, start by taking stock of things that restore your soul. So consider things like sleeping in or taking a nap, sharing a meal with family or friends, making sure that the work of that meal prep and cleanup does not fall on one person. Maybe you'd like to go fishing. Maybe that's restorative for your soul. Some kind of physical activity, whether alone, like going on a walk, or with a group, like playing pickleball or something like that. Does reading for pleasure restore your soul? Does playing in the backyard with your kids or grandkids or having a family game night, does that restore your soul? Participating in some kind of hobby. Make a list for yourself, the things that bring you joy, the things that restore your soul, the things that, while maybe not lying down and doing nothing, still bring a feeling of rest and peace. Make a list of those, and then consider how to integrate those into a Sabbath day. Also consider what would be a good time for you and your family to have a consistent day of rest, and then commit to marking that off on your calendar. And that's tough, especially if you have kids in sports or anything along those lines. But it does require a bit of a commitment, and sometimes drawing those boundaries around Sabbath is hard, but that's what makes it a discipline. That's what makes it a practice. And we will fail. That's all right. Remember, the point isn't to do nothing for 24 hours. It's to honor our limits as finite created beings, to embrace things in life that are restorative, and to honor God by allowing God to take the reins of the world and the reins of our lives. As with all practices, the key is to do it with presence and intention. And just a note, our plethora of electronic devices can make Sabbath keeping really challenging. We can easily default to watching TV or scrolling social media or playing video games. We must weigh any life-giving elements those things give us versus stress or mindlessness that they bring. And while Sabbath will undoubtedly produce some boredom, boredom is not the same as mindlessness. That's what we need to pay attention to. Each person will need to decide how much to allow electronics into their Sabbath practice, and then set hard boundaries around that practice and setting those electronics aside. Other boundaries will be necessary too, participation in sports or things of that nature. That's up to the individual and to the family to decide for themselves. The main goal is actually to move towards putting elements of Sabbath keeping into practice in our lives. That's the thing, to actually do it. We remember that Sabbath always is a means of grace. It is a way to encounter and be transformed by God over years of continual practice. Just like an instrument, you don't do it well when you first pick it up. It takes years of practice. And our efforts as well are always, always held in grace. We will fail. We will pick up our phone, or we will binge watch a TV show, or will otherwise violate some Sabbath-keeping boundary that we've set. The point isn't whether we succeed brilliantly or fail spectacularly. The point is that we keep choosing to move ever deeper into the gift of Sabbath rest given to us by God. And ultimately, we remember that Jesus himself is our Sabbath rest because Jesus accomplished everything on the cross. We do not need to work to earn that salvation. We rest from that work. We let go of that work. Sabbath is a free gift from God. And part of keeping the Sabbath holy is remembering and honoring that Jesus is the one who did that work. Jesus is the one who worked to secure our place in and with God. As we close, remember that it is holy and good to resist a culture that tells us that our value and identity are bound up in what we produce. The truth is that our value comes solely from the fact that God created us because God wanted to. We exist because of and for love. Keeping Sabbath is a radical resistance to the lie that we control anything in this life. It is a way of saying God alone is the one in charge, and God alone is the one capable and worthy of being in charge.